Chapter 4 The Great Mogul. Jack and Annie froze. The hall was completely still and silent. The Great Mogul climbed the steps to the peacock throne. He wore an orange turban and a silver coat trimmed with diamonds and pearls. He wore ropes of jewels around his neck and sparkling rings on his fingers. The Great Mogul sat cross-legged on a cushion and looked coldly at his audience. He had a handsome face with a sharp nose and dark, distant eyes. A servant stood near him, waving a large peacock feather fan. Another waved a broom to shoo away flies. An imperial guard escorted a pair of European ambassadors up the wide steps that led to the throne. Jack and Annie watched carefully as the ambassadors stood before the Great Mogul. The two men bowed from their waists and brushed the back of their right hands over the carpet. They straightened up, raised their right hands into the air, and placed their palms on top of their heads. Then they lowered their hands and stood very still. So that's the way to bow before a Great Mogul, thought Jack. He hoped he and Annie could remember how to do it. One of the ambassadors then opened a bag and pulled out a jewel-studded crown and a golden goblet. He gave them to the Great Mogul. The ruler looked at the glittering gifts. Without smiling, he handed them to a servant who had appeared beside him. Another servant stepped forward with a silver tray. On the tray was a red satin pillow. Spread across the pillow were dozens of glittering jewels. The ambassadors selected several precious gems. Then they turned and walked slowly down the steps of the throne. Annie nudged Jack. He looked at her, and she smiled. He knew just what she was thinking. Those guys got jewels without saying a word. But Jack was still worried. An emerald rose wasn't an ordinary jewel. Plus, his story seemed like such a teeny gift compared to a crown and a gold goblet. The other ambassadors climbed the peacock throne in pairs. They all bowed in the same way. Then they all opened their bags and gave gifts to the Great Mogul: a carved wooden clock, a crystal necklace, a gleaming silver sword. As the ruler received each exquisite gift, he never changed his expression. Jack grew more and more anxious. If the Great Mogul seemed bored with these treasures, what would he think of a kid's story? All the ambassadors from Europe were offered jewels from the silver tray. Then they resumed their place in line. Finally, an imperial guard beckoned to Jack and Annie. It was their turn. Jack's legs felt wobbly as he walked with Annie up the steps of the throne. The Great Mogul looked at them with his distant, cold stare. Together, Jack and Annie bowed from their waists. They brushed the back of their right hands over the carpet. They stood up and raised their right hands into the air. They placed their palms on top of their heads. Jack held his breath the whole time. A fly landed on his nose, but he didn't flinch. Jack and Annie lowered their arms. Jack's hands were shaky as he unbuckled his bag and pulled out his story. Without a word, he handed it to the Great Mogul. The ruler stared at the first page. Slowly he ran his fingers over the fancy type. He turned the page and stared at Annie's sparkly drawing of the treehouse in Frog Creek Woods. Again he touched the page. Then the Great Mogul raised his eyes and looked straight at Jack and Annie. The next thing Jack knew, the servant was standing in front of them with the tray of jewels. In a panic, Jack stared at the pile of diamonds, pearls, and red, green, and yellow gems. The jewels were all cut in different shapes. Emerald rose, Jack thought wildly. He tried to focus, but the glittering gems swirled in front of his eyes. Flowers, fish, stars, birds, butterflies, pears, and apples. But no emerald rose. When Jack glanced up, he saw the Great Mogul watching him. Jack was ready to grab anything. Annie reached forward and carefully picked up a green stone. She solemnly showed it to Jack. It was a small emerald shaped like a rose. Jack nodded, trying to appear calm. His heart was pounding. He glanced at the Great Mogul. The ruler was looking at him with interest. He seemed about to say something, but then a guard beckoned for Jack and Annie to leave the throne platform. Jack and Annie climbed down the steps and returned to their places behind the other ambassadors. Wow, 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 Jack thought. We did it! The Great Mogul stood up from his cushion. Quickly and quietly, he walked down the steps of the peacock throne. No one moved as the all-powerful ruler slipped out of the hall. The whole audience seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Everyone began talking and moving about. The guard stepped forward to escort the ambassadors through the door at the back of the hall. "Come on, let's get out of here," Jack whispered to Annie. He pulled her away from the other ambassadors, and they joined the stream of court nobles heading toward the doors at the front of the hall. "Mission accomplished!" Annie exclaimed. She handed Jack the emerald rose. Jack stared at the delicately cut stone. It had 5 tiny rose petals that curled back at the edges. "Great work," he said to Annie. He carefully put the jewel in his bag and buckled it. "I was wrong. You were right." "I won't rub it in," said Annie with a grin. "That's okay. I deserve it," Jack said. "I shouldn't have worried so much. Now we just have to get back to the tree house. Keep your head down. Move quickly." Jack and Annie wound their way through the crowd, heading for the front doors. Just as they were about to step into the sunlight, another guard blocked their way. "Excuse us," said Jack. He tried to step around the guard, who towered over them. But the guard put his large hand out. "I will escort you now to the palace," he said. "To the private balcony of the Great Mogul." Why?" Jack asked. "All the ambassadors are to view a parade in their honor," said the guard. "Parade?" said Annie. "I love parades." But we're kind of in a hurry. Do we have a choice?" Jack asked. "No," said the guard. "Oh," said Jack. "Okay." "This way," said the guard. Jack and Annie walked after him back through the empty hall. "Don't worry," Annie whispered to Jack. "What could possibly go wrong at a parade?"